and thank you for joining us. My name is Lauren Paredes, and I'm one of the editors at First Matter Press. All of us here at the Press are excited to begin our third and final installment of the Conversation and Cohort series for our 2021 book releases. We will begin tonight's event with the land acknowledgement. We honor the First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and traditional custodians of these lands, past, present, and emerging. We are curating this conversation from Portland, Oregon, and points eastward, traditional and ancestral lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Chinook, Kathlamet, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes and bands of the Columbia and Willamette regions. If you know the names of the First Nation peoples where you are, please acknowledge them now in your mind and in your heart. If you do not know their names, let this be an invitation to commit to learning these names and investing yourself in an ongoing learning of these histories and the present day experiences of Indigenous people and communities where you are. In this online space that we shared together today, we recognize our responsibility to center and work in solidarity with Indigenous communities and other communities negatively impacted by settler colonialism. We recognize that these words are not enough and this action and investment are required. Thank you for that, Ash. I'd also like to take this opportunity to share a little bit more about our press and what we've been up to since our beginnings in the summer of 2018. Over the last 3 years, we've published 12 titles ranging from formal poetry to experimental nonfiction. Our mission is to dissolve barriers for writers who are hoping to realize an important goal of publication, primarily for the first time, meanwhile creating community. Each year, the press works with a different local artist to design cohesive and meaningful cover art, which you can see here. Over the last few months, we've attained 501c3 status, which is something we're very excited about. If you'd like to know more about what we do, I invite you to check us out at firstmatterpress.org. I will now hand it over to Andra, who will let you know what you can expect from tonight's Conversation and Cohort event. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. So as Lauren said, this is our last installment of this conversation for this year, but they've been a great success and we've really enjoyed them. So I suspect that there will be more in the future, either for previous authors or for new authors in our coming year. So tonight we're going to be looking at Gabby's book, The Growth Lines, and the conversation in Cohort came out of an idea that we're all very interested in community and thinking about the way that creativity is fostered inside of community. And so we thought this would be a really good opportunity for the authors to have a conversation amongst themselves and talk about what their inspirations have been and how they've influenced each other and what their curiosities are as they've read each other's work. So the agenda for tonight, we will hear Gabby read a selection of her poetry. And then after that, the three authors will have a conversation about Gabby's work. And as audience members, you are welcome and encouraged to type questions into the chat if you have any questions for Gabby. And then at the end, we'll go through and ask those audience questions for the authors. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Andra. My name is Ash, and I have the pleasure of introducing Gabby this evening. And if you are a person who knows Gabby, then you know, like I do, that Gabby is a human who endeavors to be playful and courageous and curious and just so generous in her dialogue with the world around her. And those are some of my favorite things about this magical person. If you don't know Gabby, then I'll share a little bit of her bio with you. Gabby Hancher is a queer creator and magic maker from Portland, Oregon. As a writer, she mindfully explores the intersection between trauma and resilience, calling upon nature and childhood for illumination. The alchemy of art and science is the crux of Gabby's playful light, seeking to help others unite mind, body, and spirit in accessible, compassionate ways. They are currently a counselor in training with a special interest in the Hakomi method and attachment work. And outside of writing, Gabby can be found dancing, enjoying nature, and studying embodied social justice practices. And I wanted to share just a bit from one of the blurbs for Gabby's books to introduce you to the growth lines. So this blurb comes from Dawn Thompson, who is one of the leaders of Portland Women Writers. In the growth lines, poet Gabby Hancher invites us to re-inhabit the liminal space of the body we come from and are born into on the human journey. Her poems open our senses to the great feat of being human, which asks each of us to descend into darkness even as we continue to open to our own becoming. The body as starting point, as compass, and finally as home, that place of self-love and acceptance of other. It's my great delight to introduce to you Gabby Hancher.
Hi, everybody. It's such a treat to be here. I'm going to read, as Ash said, a selection of poems tonight. I'm going to start with a few Mary Oliver poems, as they definitely have had a big impact on my work. And then I'll read a few from my recent work and some newer things that I have been fiddling around with. So without further ado, we have Invitation by Mary Oliver. Oh, do you have time to linger for just a little while out of your busy and very important day for the goldfinches that have gathered in a field of thistles for a musical battle to see who can sing the highest note or the lowest, or the most expressive of mirth, or the most tender? Their strong, blunt beaks drink the air as they strive melodiously, not for your sake and not for mine, and not for the sake of winning, but for the sheer delight and gratitude. Believe us, they say. It is a serious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in the broken world. I beg of you, do not walk by without pausing to attend to this rather ridiculous performance. It could mean something. It could mean everything. It could be what Rilke meant when he wrote, "You must change your life." Don't Hesitate by Mary Oliver. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb. And I will move into some excerpts from my new book, On the Business of Being Born. I'm in darkness. It's my first time in this place, or else I've been here before. I think maybe I'm arriving, but when I ask, the universe sighs and starts braiding chlorophyll into my hair. I would say it's a lot like the womb, but I've never been there. Or else I have, but the memory leaves a hole where my mind will someday form, and I'm left wondering if my mother really did stop dinner for my arrival. It's possible I'm screaming, but the sound is muffled by dirt, or else I have no mouth. And the business of being born is a strange one. I could tell you about all the pieces of me, but they will someday become something else, made of the same recycled stardust. Despite this orchestrated chaos, my roots grow down into legs, and the universe begins to hum my true name over and over and over, so I can feel my way through the entanglement until I'm certain that there's nothing left to do but grow toward what I will soon remember is the sun. Blooming isn't easy, and it's good to remember a lot of people have done it before me. The Alchemist. She told me there was light vibrating down my spine, through the body. So I practiced this strange alchemy, hearing the way light transforms to darkness and back to light. Dual serpents coil tighter toward each other, their curling scales scaffolding my being. Lips part and melodic tributaries erupt outward. Snakes are actually unborn sentences. I am overflowing with them. Then our hands meet in Holy Palmer's kiss. I cannot contain what joy feels like in my own skin, so I'm giving it to you. You receive my creation as if you had always known the sound of being alive. Inheritance. This season, I watched my mind. worn neural pathways that spiral outward until the networks gleam like city lights. Then zoom into the head of a needle as burning brilliance becomes blinding heartache, indistinguishable from the way everything must die. Shame slides into the corners of my eyes until I'm seeing the shape of her in the dark again, wondering if this is my inheritance. The child self hasn't learned words yet, tears every single book from the shelf, searching for a reminder of how badly I wanted to befriend stinging bees in spring, how stars are dead but still light our paths, that this is all just a story passed down by old hands. I was made to burn this landscape to the ground. Not in my lifetime, you say, praying nightly, but I was not made in your image. Property was never holier than people. Your silence hangs heavy on the pulpit. What is left except to unleash the fury of generations past upon all your diligently hoarded finery? Reject your offer of easily afforded comfort. Disrobe mine again and again, howling grief into the night. Hymns for the fall of capitalism, set injustice ablaze. Avoidance. Throat clenches, tight discord, inflammation. Anxiety croons, what a bullshit performance. Eat away at ego, sickening crunch. You are bathed in red. It's hard to be alone. It's hard to be alone like this. Breathing catches fire, shake the body, overwhelm, lie in breath, shake again to be sure. It's hard to be alone. It's hard to be alone. Cooling breath. Open mouth sigh. Animal releases, I watch and say, thank you. Breathing. Left lobe inflates. For the first time, not dissecting every period that comes at the end of an unfamiliar dialogue, but bearing witness to migrating thoughts, searching for their destination. Careen into routine ungracefully. Inhale, exhale, forward fold, forward fall toward chaotic beauty, more spaciousness than what was remembered. Right lobe inflates. Today, presence. Queer roots. I hadn't known you yet. Sweet seeds were planted but denied essential nourishment. A growth cycle spent watering sapphic enmeshment. Yet here I am, welcoming you into my life. I won't hide this galaxy brain body anymore. Witness my blooming, my unfolding, my becoming. Fertilize this transformation until the tender blooms unfurl out of this soft earth. Let it be perfectly messy, a reflection of all possibilities in this lifetime. And when I kiss my beautiful husband each night, marveling at our holographic existence, tasting the sweetness of it on my tongue, I know my queer roots run deep. An offering to my inner world. I found her in my dusty chalk fingers, sunburnt nose, cheeky grin, arranging my worries into bouquets, sense-making in all that darkness. We stop on our walk to smell every bloom, name every four-legged friend we happen upon, then settle for art making on the concrete. Tell me again, what is the color of thriving? And then this is a selection of new work that I have been working on that I'm very excited to share. We are not prey. The heart hardens, stony and barren, on the backs of all who labor without dreams, must be shook from the inside out until the guts are exposed, until the anger is rinsed clean from our systems. Through hymns, we've routinely been conditioned to forget. And when the grief finally claws its ways to the throat, it wails inconsolable. Let it be a love song for all who work to live. Serenade the ones who forgot we are made of animal bones, all snot and tears and blood, shaking like elephants, infinite wrinkles and wisdom. We were made for this moment, to remember the bounty of our wide meadow hearts. How safety can feel like a frightened bird that did not see the glass, a heart that beats frantically as you lay there on domestic concrete, contrasted starkly by the liminal hours when you think you are asleep or in state of emergency. Sweet one, dear one, surround this nightly grieving with essential tenderness, wrap it up in feathered gauze, fragrant with lavender longing, until fragile bird bones become airborne once more, until tender buds in right time bloom through winter's frost. Let this love take any form it likes. In my mind, I unfold her like an atlas. Bodies so expanded they become water. Sugar that dissipates on the tongue, now invisible to the naked eye, but I taste it in my dreams. An exothermic reaction to guide me home. The body returns. The moment crocuses burst forth from stony ground, shaking pained limbs of violet and ivory, envying the effortless ochre of the daffodils after winter's swallowed spores bloom in the pleura of lungs, burned them up, yet this isn't sickness. This sickness isn't death, just rebirth. And sweet songs which come from the red-crested robin's throat call spirit back to body, photosynthesize the sun's caress on nape of neck, wobble again on fresh fawn legs, sip sweet morning dew air, return again and again, even when pain drips down like hot honeyed nectar. I will break through hardened concrete cracks and bloom right here on the sidewalk. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Gabby. You'll give me a second. I'm going to invite our other two poets here to be on spotlight. Find them. All right. So welcome, Dan, and welcome, Jessica. I have all of you on spotlight now. And there we go. So I'll invite you all into conversation here. And just as a starting off point for Gabby, I'm feeling curious about the place where your work kind of intersects a relationship with the earth. And I was wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about that inspiration, where it comes from, maybe if it comes from specific experiences or more of a general place. I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Ash. I would say that a lot of kind of the inspiration I've had recently, well, I've always, as a kid, I was like always like digging in the dirt and like burying my toy dinosaurs, like, and, you know, things like that. Right. And like, I spent a lot of time out in the woods by myself, tromping around and, you know, discovering magic and fairies and all kinds of things, upturning rocks and looking at worms and, you know, all the stuff that kids do. Right. Like, so I think I've always just sort of had this connection. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized sort of like what that was doing for me, which is like that being outside is like a really regulating experience for my nervous system. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm outside, it's like, yeah, I just feel so much more connected to myself and to spirit and to all kinds of things. And I think that that's just sort of naturally woven its way into what's interesting to me in the world. Like, I think plants and trees and like I love learning little things, like, right, like how trees talk to each other. That's just like, oh, that's like the freaking coolest thing ever. So it's things like that. And then kind of on like a different level of that, like I was thinking recently about the gifts of my family. And one of them is that in my lineage, we have a lot of, like, my great-great-grandfather opened up a florist shop in Spokane, which is where I grew up. And so there's this kind of history of like working with plants and the earth and working in the dirt. And I think that that's just kind of really started to come back into my life recently. in a profound way for me. And so that's just like what I'm interested in writing about right now. That's just kind of what's come in. And it feels really important to be exploring that relationship as it pertains to where I am now in the world on this particular land and like how I relate to it. As an adult person, I guess, and as someone who wants to treat the earth differently than, I was taught how as I grew up. So what about the rest of y'all? Does I know, Jessica, you have a lot of like bug imagery and things like that. And I think Dan, you have birds, and it seems like we all kind of have like a different, almost like niche section of like kind of exploring nature as it relates to our writing.
Things tend to fly into and out of my poems. Something about that being able to pass in and out, back and forth, things being impermeable, I think, without trying to take it apart too much.
Right.
I do wonder if that's why there's just so many birds in them.
And did you grow up in the suburbs?
I did.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I wonder about that because I grew up in a rural community.
Mhm.
And so Gabby, when you're talking about, being in the dirt, that was a big part of, like there was an actual dinner bell, like outside the back of our house, and I have 4 siblings. So it was just like summertime scatter, go and don't come home unless you're bleeding bad.
Right.
Like real bad. So, Dan, I also know that like the suburbs of, not to make any assumptions about your age, but the suburbs of are not necessarily the suburbs that my kids are growing up in. So I'm just curious, like what that, like when you reflect on that, how that might show up in your work.
I think it was assumed you could kind of just go anywhere and do anything. And I think you sort of write about it that way. Like there are no sort of permissions you need or boundaries to observe. It's all just laid out. And as you kind of say, it's like, stay away from home. Like we're good here. So you just go and amuse yourself in whatever you do. And you were trusted, you could sort of handle it. I wonder that too, just that attitude of being tacitly raised to handle yourself, even though we weren't like city kids. It wasn't like cutthroat, but it affects kind of how you see things. And, if you go into an art, I think it affects how you approach it, how you give yourself permission to do it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I hear that for sure.
Yeah. So you two are the rural ones, and I'm just the lone suburbanite of this triad.
Well, that's not totally true. I grew up in many different places, and that's kind of the interesting thing of it, is that I had like suburban home that I like, kind of like you're talking about that experience, Dan, of like, I would walk around in the middle of the night and be like, I'm totally safe and fine, right? Like up to shenanigans in my neighborhood. And then I also would go to places. My dad lived in Port Angeles, and so I was there, which, there are parts of Port Angeles that are more suburban, but like where my dad usually lived was like out in the woods or like really far away from other people. So I was just like, kind of like dinking around in the backyard, or like he lived in one house where there was like a river that I was attached to. So I'd go out and play in the river and, find stinging nettles and all kinds of trouble, but like that sort of thing, right? Where like I kind of grew up in Hawaii. I also lived in Hawaii actually for a while. And so I was exposed to kind of being outside in that kind of an environment too. So just like all these different, all these really different kinds of like nature places that I had access to.
Yeah. Definitely. It definitely shows, I think.
Yeah, agreed. And Gabby, I'm curious, when you think about your work and both your writing and then the other parts of your life, when you think about like embodiment practices, and kind of, I don't know. I mean, there's certain poems where you're really like tapped into that like experience of the natural world with multiple senses, right? So not just what do you see, but what do you smell, what do you taste? And I'm just curious, like, I don't know, how does this come to be on a piece of paper? How do you get there?
Yeah, such a great question. Sometimes I don't even know how that happens. It's kind of like, I think my body is my greatest asset, and I mean that in like many ways, of course, but like, it's true though. Like even just the way that I kind of engage with the world, all the information kind of gets filtered through, like, what am I feeling right now? what am I smelling right now? And how, you know, like, what am I hearing? I'm really sense oriented, I think. And so when I'm writing, I actually was thinking about this earlier, like when I write, it's really challenging for me to write unless I create a ritual out of it. And then when I've created the ritual container, I'm writing, and I'm just sort of like writing about the experience that I'm having. And sometimes there will be like a theme or something that I'm kind of like digging into, right? That kind of I'm like maybe pulling apart, or like an experience or memory. Like a lot of times it's memories. It's like kind of like finding the details of memories that I can feel still in my body. But it just sort of like comes in, and it's almost like being possessed. I just like write it all down, right? And then like the rest of the process comes out later. And a lot of times I can't plan what I'm going to write. And like if I do that, if I plan it, it doesn't feel like natural, and it doesn't feel like the thing that actually wants to be like embodied or expressed. I have to just let it come through my body, like whatever is there. It's definitely, it is really like, and that's how I'm in relationship with people too. Like again, if I'm like relating to someone, I'm like checking in with my body and saying, how do I feel right now? Like what information is coming up right now through like my senses and my experience.
Gabby, when you talk about ritual, like there needs to be ritual when you write, what does that look like?
Yeah.
If I were to observe you, what would I see? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, I think for me, well, there's a couple ways. I either have to be like totally alone and like by myself, or I really I think I actually do my best writing in communal spaces. I think I do my best, my most embodied, connected writing with I have a couple groups that I'm in, right, where we like gather and we like open, like there might be like some way of like, okay, here we are, and we're honoring that we're opening this process together. We're going to all sit and write. And then there's like time to kind of, like take in maybe some like juicy information, maybe other people's poems and sharing. And then after that, there's like a reflection period or a free write period. When I'm by myself, it's like I kind of have to like put the rest of the world away, like in some way, right? So it's like I'll go into my room and I'll shut the door and I'll light some incense and take some breaths and kind of trying to get into myself. And then I usually have to like do a dump of like, here's my thinking brain doing all the thinking things. And like, I'm going to write a really bad poem about all my thinking thoughts, like that has to come out first. And then I can kind of get into like the, under the iceberg and like get in there. Do
you tend to surprise yourself, or do you kind of sort of know where you want to go?
It's usually a surprise. I usually I'll sometimes I have like things that, like when you get those like 3 a.m. like little like, and they come in and you're like, all right, I got to let it go and it'll come back later. Like sometimes those things do come back. But sometimes if I hold on to those too tight and I try to like force that to happen, like that's a no good. So I usually am surprised because it'll be something maybe that was like 3 months ago I was thinking about, or like, whatever. And now it's decided to emerge. Yeah.
They tend to, it's Noah. Hey.
Hey.
I like it when things sort of incubate on their own and sort of have the decency and the courtesy to present themselves when they're ready to be hatched.
Right. The dignity of it all.
Just have some writerly decency and show up.
Exactly. Right? This is hard enough without you messing with my. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Do you guys have rituals? Like, do you have, or like you just kind of like you could sit down at the airport, right, and just like whip it out? Like, what's the vibe here?
I mean, I have a whole. Maybe I talked about this the last time we were all together, but just some of my writing practices, even beyond poetry. So I write every night. I don't know if I talked about this last time. So I don't know. I mean, I've always journaled. But I made a commitment to myself, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, to write every night before I went to bed without any rules or expectations for what I write. So it could be 2 sentences, it could be 2 pages. And a few years ago, I also started included gratitudes every night. And that goes in line with reading a poem every night. So I've been working my way through collections of different poets for 7 or 8 years now. So the whole Rita Dove's collected work, right? Yusuf Komunyakaa. Right now I'm finishing up Mary Oliver's full on. And then I've got Ross Gay waiting in the wings, and I'm so excited.
Awesome.
So those two at night are part of what just feeds my work, because I'll go back through the journal or I'll tag things with a sticky note like, ooh, that feels like maybe something I could find a poem with. Okay, let's see. Dan, I don't know about you in terms of like, the other practices that you have in your work.
Solitude does seem to be part of it. And it's being very attentive to what is going to work, because too much habit is bad. Too much thinking, oh, if I don't have my lucky hat, then it's not going to work. So
Yeah.
if I'm sat down and it's not happening, I'll close the laptop and pick up a pen, or vice versa. Or, maybe I'll hit Wikipedia for 5 minutes and just let something hit me in the face. Just room for chance always has to be that, I think. So it's a bit of ritual and non-ritual, anti-ritual.
Yeah, I love that. The room for chance too. Yeah, that tension between, if it's too boxed in, then there's not going to be the creativity, like the creative energy. But if it's too open, then there's like that, some semblance of some kind of container, right? But not too tight.
Yeah, and never to get into the thing of like, oh well, if my environment isn't just right, I can't possibly be creative, because that's just giving into fear, and that's excuse making. So you don't even you shut that down.
For sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
And I'm voice memos. Maybe we talk about voice. I'm a huge fan of voice memos, right? If I'm driving
I hate the sound
and
of
I
my
have
own
an
voice.
idea, that part I agree with. But I love the creation of the voice memo, so that when I'm driving, I can just like talk it through, and then I'll go back and listen and say like, oh, because I'm old enough to realize now that just because a good line comes to me doesn't mean it will ever come back.
No,
true. I'm gonna hit it while I can. Or it might turn out I thought it was a brilliant line, and then later I go back and listen to the voice memo and I despise it. But at least I had a moment,
So, wonder what that was like to think that was good.
Yeah.
That person is gone.
Yes.
It's real.
Yeah. For sure.
Oh my God.
Gabby, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know Tian had brought this up, but I'm also just thinking about this with kind of all the different perspectives you have, the use you have in your book of these lines, right? And the visuals that you're using alongside the poems. And I'm wondering if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, totally. That was 100% a collaboration with Ash. That like Ash, we had talked about some picked some images that we wanted to put in there. But it just wasn't really like working out, wasn't really landing. And so then we were like, well, what else could we put there? And then Ash came up with just this like beautiful kind of like flowing, and at the end they kind of spiral right in this like the circle poem. And there's something, I don't know, what I really like about it is like, it's called the growth lines. And so here we are looking at these lines kind of like almost like going on their own journey throughout the book, interweaving and then disconnecting. And that's really about it. Really, Ash, that was something that Ash and I sat down and like kind of chatted about. There's not a ton of like depth to it in that sense, but that's okay though, right? It's kind of this really simplistic, beautiful thing, I think. And it just really like when I saw it, I was like, yes, brought that together.
Simple in the way that works, I think. And I was in one of our previous conversations, I remember I talked about the poem just has to look pretty on the page. And I love how these lines kind of wrap up all the pieces of the book and give it a through line, kind of a flow. And with very little, there's no complexity because it's not about that. You don't need anything fancy.
Right.
Yeah, and they're almost kinesthetic, which I like, right?
Yeah.
And so I appreciate again, coming back to that way that you tap into multiple senses as you, with your work, right? Even just the book's presentation and that use of like movement in
Yeah.
Right.
lines. It's really
sort of
lovely.
calm, but it's not still. There's
Yeah,
things at work always, which
that's
Yeah.
right.
is
That's
very
right.
nicely done.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks, Ash.
Yeah.
Props for Ash.
I definitely think
Big
that
one.
that is like thematically appropriate for like pretty much all the kinds of, because I make a lot of different kinds of art. Like, poetry is actually something I'm relatively new to. But like I do like, you know, like I used to paint and I draw and I dance and I do like a lot of the things that I'm drawn to are things that inherently have that quality of like being really kinesthetic and being movement oriented and going somewhere and being imbued with energy and life is like as if they couldn't possibly be still, like they have to be, you know, doing something and yeah, so I think that makes sense.
Yeah. I wanted to go, and I don't even know if I sent this question by email, but the poem Breathing, when I read that, I flashed back so hard to all of our talks about mindfulness.
Yeah.
That's the most precise representation of that on a page I think I've ever seen. That will be anthologized in a Zen anthology someday. Because that was just the way the moment sort of pause and then, you know, I thought it was very well done and kind of opened a window into some previous things we talked about. And I thought this was really a nice, perfect little moment kind of served up to us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That one definitely, like the last couple years of my life have been pretty dedicated to studying like mindfulness practices. And it's pretty much like the even the therapeutic Hakomi, which is the type of therapy that I am studying, is based in that. Like that's like the kind of like a pillar, a core pillar of it, and tool that's used in it. So I think, in terms of like my work, again, that sort of that like imbuing things with ritual and like really being present to my body. That's like what mindfulness is about to me. It's about being in my body and being, you know, and like, and although sometimes I guess when I'm writing, I get a little dissociative, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, right? Like where I'm like, oh, like what's happening here on this page? I don't even know, but like, what a curious thing that is too. So, but yeah.
Those are the gifts when that happens.
Yeah,
I think
just strikes you, comes through,
and you can observe it neutrally.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, in that poem, I had some notes from that. One of the things I wrote down is the line where you have today : presence, right? And that to me, right there, it's like it maybe Dan, it's even that like Zen moment in the Zen poem, right? Today : presence.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
right there.
Short, succinct.
Yeah, I mean, my 7-year-old, maybe like he often says, I don't want to talk about the past and I don't want to talk about the future. I just want to be here right now. I'm like, good call out. Thank you.
Good reminders.
Spot on, buddy.
Got you there. Yeah.
Little wise ones
day,
they are.
All day, every day.
Well, I think that poem, I think it illuminates something that I think most of the pieces in the book do, is where every stanza, every little element really stands very well on its own. Like they can be pondered on their own and they work together, but there's very little sort of sense of a lapse between stanzas. I mean, they're just nice little units of thought that you can sort of ponder and sit with. And I appreciate that a lot. It made going through the book a nice experience.
Yeah, and maybe Gabby, like maybe that brings us to a question I know I've been kicking around, which is just the way you chose to use the space on the pages and the way you chose to break poems apart and move stanzas from left, justified, center, right, and spreading poems across multiple pages and really creating a lot of breathing space. Was that something you'd been working on before the book, or was that something that as you were working through the book process began to emerge? Where did that?
That was definitely in the process of making the book. Again, that was another kind of collaborative moment with Ash where like, it's exactly what you're kind of pointing to there. Like, right. Like you get a moment, you get to sit with it for a second, and then you get to move on to the next thing and kind of just let everything sort of like dissolve and, unpack itself. And, and I think that is like right, because there's all this movement, and then it's kind of nice to have like a pause between the movement, which is also a mindfulness practice in and of itself, right? Is like you do something, you take something in, you let it sit, you like kind of, it like reverberates in your system, and then you move on to the next thing. And I think when Ash kind of, brought that, she brought that forward, they brought that forward for me, and then, gave me like the copy, and I was looking at it, yes, this is it. And it just feels, it feels kind of, I guess it feels really natural that way to me, to see it laid out like that. And then some of them have a movement that like avoidance has like kind of this like slanted, this slanted sort of like way. And I again, like wasn't the way I originally had it, but then when I saw it, I was like, well, it couldn't possibly be any other way. It has to be this way. Like it just has that like kind of, it's like a little off center. It's a little like, ooh, like, why is it going that way? Like, yeah, it like adds just like a little, like almost like another sense to the experience of reading it, which
well, it's very confining, like, which I thought I love particularly how that piece works, and that you feel constricted on the page with it.
Right.
I thought that worked really well.
Yeah. And like same goes to y'all. Like, did you, when you like were placing your poems, and like, is that something that you typically do? Like, do you often like I know Dan, you've talked a lot about like, like a beautiful poem on a page and like seeing it, and like, can you speak to kind of that for all of y'all's work? Like, do you just usually like block it out, or do you like kind of like, do you have a vision for it?
I think I'll say, just in addition to what I've talked about with my aesthetic sort of hangups, is there's a certain sense like with poems, if I'm doing a poem that's enjammed, I get a little mischievous, and I like sort of wanting to almost throw the reader a little curveball with it, and see how much I can shake them without throwing them out of the car.
Right.
Not too much of that, because that's chaos,
good.
but just every now and then, bring them up a little suddenly with a transition or with an unexpected break. Just to remind them you're sitting there reading my poem.
Yep. If I had to pick one poetic device to marry, like the that old game where it's like the person you marry, the person you have a romance with, and the person you threw off a cliff. But you could do that with poetic devices, right? And like the one I would be with for forever would be Enjambment. Like I could never leave Enjambment. I love it so much. Perhaps what did you, an aesthetic hang up? Like,
that's good.
That was the other thing, but
right. But I think I definitely think a lot about Enjambment, and I think I've talked about like pulse, right? And like how lines pulse, and thinking a lot about uneven pulsing, right? So odd numbers, is there 3 pulses in this line, 5? I don't tend to sit with a lot of even numbers. That feels a little too organized, and just not as like how my heart feels when I'm writing, maybe. But I think, when I write everything first, it always comes out in just one big like, so it takes a while to, to start to figure out. To take a while to just figure out how the lines speak to each other. But I will say that seeing all the pieces together in a book really brought me to a different place of thinking about, whoa, okay, like there's a lot of density here. Okay, where can I bring more space in? Or like, ooh, that seems like maybe there's a lot. How do I maybe give the reader a little bit more time to pause? And so seeing them in conversation with each other shifted definitely how I think about the way I keep work happening on the page.
I had one of the pieces from my book, this time he's Jacob. It ended up basically as a prose paragraph. It actually started as a lineated poem in its early stages. And I think the prospect of dealing with it both on its own terms and as part of a wider group, I had to sort of rethink how it worked. And then, so I ended up prosifying it. It actually sort of fell back into organization in a way, and became this outlier paragraph amongst the rest of the book.
Well, that's really interesting.
Prosifying.
That's a good one.
That is. I like that. I know I'm cognizant of time, but there's some really great questions popping up. I don't know.
Do we take crowd questions at this point?
What are your thoughts, Lauren? Just because I have more questions for Gabby, but there's some really great ones, and I don't know where we are in time because time is a construct.
Yeah, we'll be doing the question and answers later on, about 10 minutes from now.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Great.
Cool.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate that. So, I mean, but I think one of the things I wanted to come back to, when you think about childhood and you think about like being this adult writer and this adult relationship, I'm wondering what you see is, how has that relationship with the natural world evolved for you? And how do you, maybe how you engaged with it when you were a child and now here you are.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's that? Yeah. What's happening with that? I'm curious.
I think it's been, I mean, kind of like I was saying, like as a child, I think I used, like outside was like imagination space. It was like, oh, you know, like fairies were a really big thing for me. I was like always outside, like trying to like get fairies to come hang out with me. I was like leaving little cakes and building little houses and, you know, stuff like that. Right. Like, come hang with me. I'm cool. And I think like as an adult, for a while, I kind of lost that. I lost that connection to imagination and to nature. And more recently have started to really pay attention to like, okay, what do I feel like when I'm outside, and like what outside spaces are the most impactful to me. So like, for instance, I really crave being alone outside in like wide open spaces where there aren't a lot of other people and it's quiet. And I can really feel kind of like the like, I guess like the pulse of the earth, or like water or something like that, right? Or I can be around animals. Oh my God, I love animals. Like anytime I see a snake, I'm just like, I'm just terrified and so excited. Like I just, you know, like I can clap my hands for joy. It's my favorite thing. Cool bugs, stuff like that, right? Like I'm very into that. And I guess as like I think you talked a little bit about this too, Jessica, like researching things and learning about things. Like I'm really into learning about plants right now, and like how to eat them and how to cook them and how to take care of them and how to have a relationship with them, and you know, what area do I live in right now. And so like there's this way of like, it's like bringing my child self along, like almost like taking the things I was doing as a child and making them really intentional. Like really like yeah, we can go into the forest and just enjoy the energetic feeling of being in the forest and really take in that nourishment. And we can also learn how to care for the forest because we really love the forest. We want to come back to the forest, right? And then we can write about it and like, you know, share that love with other people in a different way. And maybe they'll want to do that too. Like these kinds of, just this way of like weaving a really that mindfulness component, really intentionally like weaving together these things that feel so important to my existence and to all of our existence, really. Definitely.
I read this book about 10 years ago. You guys may have heard of it, called The World Without Us, by a guy named Alan Weisman. And it's this expanded thought experiment of what would happen to the planet if everybody vanished simultaneously. All the buildings, all the nuclear reactors, and like what happens. And I think it's stayed with me so well because I think part of what I get when I'm out in the natural world is, you know, we are the fleas on the dog's back. So I want to like imagine just the dog without the fleas. Like nature, you know, is observed by humans, but it exists apart from humans. It was here before us. It will be here after us. And the pondering of that kind of just pulls my mind like a tide a lot. And a lot of what I end up writing about comes out of that, this trying to grasp it, really. Like, what does it even mean? This whole big thing that we are inhabiting and we understand so little of, really, as much as we do understand. So it's kind of, there's this element of spirituality to it, and there's an element of just pure intellectual, like gobsmack in this, like, oh my God, you know.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think about Walt Whitman, right? Like, we contain multitudes, you know? And like, we contain multitudes within multitudes within multitudes. Like, when I learned about holobionts, my brain exploded. I was like,
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, what is that?
It's one of my next tattoos. So A holobiont is an ecosystem within an ecosystem, right? So your like gut bacteria is a holobiont. We are holobionts. We are holobionts in the holobiont of the planet. Like,
yeah.
What? Also, I just think the word is so much fun to say.
It's a very cool word.
Like, is that a word? Right? Hello, what? But again, is that like it's within? It's just that withinness, so much withinness, and it's like when you see those blown up pictures of a cell, you're like, how does all this stuff fit in there? What?
It's so beautiful. It's like it's such a miracle. Like, well, that's exactly it, right? It's like it's like the miracle of like, wow, we're alive. What a crazy thing that is. Like, in so many ways. Like, there are so many different like lenses you can put on that too.
Yeah.
And you're kind of pointing to another thing, Jessica, which I think maybe answers the question you asked me earlier a little bit better, which is like, I think I look to nature for lessons I didn't learn and couldn't learn or couldn't process in life as a young person. And so there's a way that like when I am looking at my queerness and thinking to myself, like, what does this mean? I'm like, oh, well, there's all of it in nature. There it is. Like, there are all the different ways I could possibly be, and how natural that is, and how normal that is, and how nature isn't always pretty, right? Sometimes it feels really ugly, and you're like, okay, yeah, that's a thing too, right? Like, it has like all the thing. It's like the life lesson book. Like, if you need to learn anything, you just look out your window and you like ask a tree a question, and the tree's like, well, there you go, and or like look at the worms, or like these kinds of things, right? Like, that's how nature feels to me. It's like this, like, oh yeah, here are all the things that like my human people couldn't articulate to me. So like my animal people and my tree people and all those things are going to articulate to me about how to be on the planet.
Yeah, that's great. Wow.
Yeah.
I love that. Have you been reading Braiding Sweetgrass? Because I'm wondering if that book sounds familiar to both of you, because there's much in that book that is part of this conversation, I think.
I started it and I haven't finished it, but it's one that's on my list. A woman who's an indigenous botanist. So she's a PhD, and she's a registered tribal member of, I'm not going to say the name because I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's there's this, right, like more kind of, Western European science, and then her indigenous, and just like the togetherness. And she talks very much about that like how she interacted with nature as a child, and then she ended up in this intellectual institution that had a much more rigid view. And actually at one point, people were telling her like, you can't talk about beauty and botany. Like, that's not what we do here. We don't discuss beauty. Like, we don't? No, it's odd. Pretty sure flowers are beautiful though.
Why are we here then?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then coming back to that as an adult with more and with all these other perspectives, and then bringing them together and saying like, I don't know if I need to reject any of this, but there's an integration here.
Yes.
Right. That's really powerful and beautiful.
Right. Right. That's how I also feel about like my therapeutic work, right? Like, there are like, it's so important to learn about like maps, like having like scientific maps for like processes that are happening in our bodies. And there's like also the embodied experience of just feeling it and not knowing. Right. And so it's like marrying those two pieces together, like the experiential pieces and the science and the learning, and like how those things, and that's like what I like poetry, right? Like, that is poetry right there. That's like ding, 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 a poem just happened, like, so that's, for sure.
Okay. So I hate to interrupt you here. I wish we could just keep on going on, because now it seems like we're just getting to like the heart of it all, the world, the center of the world, and how we see it. But I just thank you all for sharing your thoughts in these 3 conversations. Dan and Gabby and Jessica, you 3 are amazing, and I've learned so much from you. And it's just been really fun to watch you all engage with each other's work and enjoy each other's company. So thank you very much for these conversations. But I want to make sure to leave a little bit of time for audience Q&A. So we have a couple questions in the chat, and if anyone else has a question, just put it in the chat and I will ask Gabby and Dan and Jessica. So I'm just going to work backwards a little. There was a question, and I'll just read it. Love how this discussion started with childhood spaces. Thinking of the poem Inheritance, and wondering if Gabby has any more to reflect on how poetry practice can serve a person's epigenetic healing. And I actually kind of had a similar question to myself about the role of compassion, since that was in your bio. So I would love to hear you all talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the juiciest topic, right?
In the last 2 minutes of our
conversation.
No big deal.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, a lot of my poetry is about generational trauma, because that's really been the theme that I've been unwinding for the last like 3 years of my life, I think. And I think that what poetry has done for me and writing has done for me is it's given voice to voiceless things. And it's helped me make my own map, my own internal experiential map of my process, of how to separate things that are mine and things that are not mine, or things that I want to, with mindfulness, reflect on in a certain way. Or even just like dreaming into who I actually want to be. Like, I'm maybe not this person right now, or this isn't the experience I'm having right now, but what would that experience feel like? And how could I capture that and share that with someone else? And then sometimes, and like, so a lot of my poems start out super personal and then kind of become a little bit more like universal through editing and other things. But that is definitely like specifically the poem Inheritance is about that, like, and like, alludes to things in my family that are experiences that other family members of mine have that I'm worried that I will have, or like, and then coming back to the realization of like, yes, this is just something that's been passed down to me and I have a choice, right? Like I can choose to do it this way or that way, or I can choose, that sort of thing. For sure.
Great. Okay, let's see. And we did talk a little bit about space. Let's see, I'm just backing up to where this question was. So talking a little bit more about space, line breaks. There was a question which I can't find at the moment. Let me see if I can get back to it. Yeah, how do you decide on line breaks?
Sometimes really arbitrarily.
Sometimes they decide you.
Yeah, that's right. Mouthfeel, how it feels when I say it, like how it looks on the page.
Good Scotch, mouthfeel.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. Yeah, I guess I like, again, like I have less of a literary background, like a formal literary background, so sometimes it is just like, yeah, this seems like a good spot, I'm gonna like break it up here. But there is intentionality to it. Like eventually there is like like this is like, I love when you can get a good little like wraparound going, like like a double meaning sentence. That's like, that's the good stuff right there.
Yeah, and kind of related, when you write, do you read aloud? Does that help you?
I don't usually read out loud when I'm in a writing process. But I do read out loud later, like after I've written everything, then I'll go back but I can hear my own voice in my head when I'm writing, which is like not everybody has that experience as I understand it, but like I can hear the sound of my own voice, like in the cadence that it might like have. But it's definitely always like when you read it out loud first or someone else reads it, you're like, oh, like that's when you like really hear, like you're like, that's not gonna work, or like, oh yeah, I really like the way that sounds, or those little edits.
Okay, well, we're almost at time, so I think I'll pass it on to Lauren. And thank you.
How does this happen?
I know.
We like ran through that,
Yeah, that was awesome. I'm kind of bummed it's over also. So thank you all again for joining us here. If you liked what you heard tonight and you'd like to purchase Gabby's book or all 3 books from this release, please head over to the link in the chat for pre-order. Our pre-order period will wrap up on August 15th and the books will be officially released in September. So check it out. And all 3 authors are holding up their beautiful copies.